Mengele was known as the Angel of Death. He wanted to improve the stock of the Aryan race.
The idea was that I should go now and try to find Mengele.
He was living in fear of being arrested.
There are sightings everywhere of Mengele.
They refused to give anything up. They said, no, it's not Mengele, it's not true. They lied, they denied it.
There were many who believed that he could have staged a death.
And there still are people who think that he's alive.
Buenos Aires, 1958. The Argentinian capital's old-world charm and famed nightlife have made it a magnet for European expatriates. It is also a magnet for Nazi war criminals, fugitives like Dr. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death.
He liked Buenos Aires, and there was a large German community, some of whom were Nazis.
He had a bit of cash, he was a man about town, and certainly he was very well connected.
He met Hans Rudel, Hitler's most decorated pilot. He met Wilhelm Sassens, who was a wanted war criminal from Belgium.
Who was still very much a passionate Nazi.
This was not a life on the run that was terrible. It was quite luxurious. And in 1958, the man that we think of as the Angel of Death, the most hunted man of the world, was in the telephone book in Argentina. One of the things that happens that changes everything for Mengele is that in 1959, he's indicted by the West German government.
The Auschwitz-Birkenau doctor is wanted for mass murder and also for performing unspeakably cruel medical experiments on children as young as 5. Germany demands Argentina hand him over to face justice.
And that scared him. It made him feel unsafe in Buenos Aires, and that was good, because he deserved to live in fear.
What Mengele doesn't know is that there is more to fear than just an extradition order. Israeli agents are on the hunt for Nazis in Argentina, and they've already caught one.
We took off his clothes to make sure that he doesn't got any weapon or razor blade to kill himself. I told him who we are and what we demand from him.
Adolf Eichmann, the architect of Hitler's final solution, is in Israeli hands.
After they kidnapped Eichmann, Zvi Aharoni interrogated him and said, "Where's Mengele? Where's Mengele?"
And he refused to answer about any question about us.
And Eichmann was absolutely, loyal and said, "I have no idea where he is."
In fact, the two had shared cake and coffee several times in Buenos Aires.
Eichmann and Mengele actually meet each other at the ABC cafe, and they don't get on very well.
He viewed Eichmann as a lower-class officer who lived in this terrible area of Argentina, in the suburb of Buenos Aires. Mengele was more regal. He associated with intellectuals. He had the top end of the Reich. Eichmann was he was a working-class stiff at the Mercedes factory.
The Mossad interrogators apply more pressure. Finally, Eichmann cracks.
He knew that Mengele was somewhere in the Argentine, maybe in Buenos Aires, but he had no contact with Mengele.
He met him before, but he had no idea of his address and what he's doing now.
For the Mossad, Mengele is right up there with Eichmann on their most wanted list.
Mengele had the worst name in Israel than Eichmann. He was a real butcher.
Mengele's big interest was in genetics, and he wanted to look at how you could improve the stock of the Aryan race and therefore propagate a master race.
The Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp was the site of Mengele's nightmarish medical lab.
part of his experiments were about sterilization. So to find out how they could sterilize the Eastern races, the Slavs, the Gypsies, the inferior races at a faster rate.
And he had power of life and death.
Most of Mengele's human guinea pigs perished.
The experiments get progressively worse, and by the time he leaves there, he is the monster that we've all come to know him for.
Three days after the Eichmann abduction, Agent Eitan meets with Isser Harel. The Mossad chief has some good news.
Isser Harel found the address of Mengele in Buenos Aires.
Isser Harel was very keen to think, I can bring back two. I could get Mengele as well.
The Mossad boss wants to mount a full-blown commando raid on the address.
He wanted to do a second operation while the first one wasn't finished. And this is bad thinking.
If you involve two things at the same time, you multiply the risk for failure. So I suggest not to do it.
But Harel doesn't want to miss what may be their only chance to capture the notorious doctor. He overrules his agents. Operation Mengele is on.
The Israelis actually went looking around Buenos Aires during that period in which they were holding Eichmann in the safe house.
They stake out a boarding house where they suspect Mengele is living.
That was really risky because we all traveled on false passports, on languages we didn't master.
If you were caught in Argentina in 1960 as a known foreign spy, you wouldn't have been executed, but you would have been the guest of the Argentine government for a very, very long time.
Mossad agents have tracked Nazi war criminal Josef Mengele to what they hope is his hideout in Buenos Aires.
He sent few people to check his apartment.
And they were making pretty sort of blatant inquiries as to where he was. And they were going up to the boarding house where they thought he had lived and said, is this where Dr. Mengele lives? Hoping that maybe they'd say, oh, don't you mean Mengele? Yes, he lives over there.
The risks were definitely the German community of Buenos Aires. There's a German community of 250,000 people then.
It is the large German community that has drawn Nazis like Eichmann and Mengele to Argentina. The country's totalitarian regime, led by Juan Perón, has made them feel right at home.
Everybody wonders, why did South America, and Argentina in particular, become the place where the Nazis came to after the war? And the truth is that there were already links between the Nazis and Argentina during the war. During the war, Perón and the Argentine government had secret agreements with Himmler's foreign espionage service. When the war ended, it was a natural extension of Argentina's role during the war for it to receive Nazis afterwards.
But he was not in the house.
Fact is that we couldn't find him. That means that he was dug in better than Eichmann.
With no sign of the Nazi doctor, Harel decides to cut his losses and return to Israel with Eichmann alone.
I'm afraid at that stage that the Mossad were on a very cold trail indeed, and Mengele had long flown the coop.
Mengele moved, not because of the Israelis, but by sheer luck to Paraguay and wouldn't be in Buenos Aires. They would miss him.
In December 1961, an Israeli court convicts Adolf Eichmann and hangs him for his crimes. But Mossad chief Isser Harel has not given up on Josef Mengele.
Harel, though, was still determined that Mengele was someone they wanted to catch. He was a notorious figure. So Aharoni was ordered to mount an operation and to try and find him.
Senior Mossad agent Zvi Aharoni returns to South America to track down the Nazi doctor.
The idea was that I should go now and try to find Mengele.
He goes undercover as a historian, writing a book about the SS. Zvi and his agents comb Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Chile.
Some information pointed the way to Paraguay, but when we were there, he had already left.
The mission proves more challenging than even the Eichmann capture. It pushes the team to the limit. Finally, after 2 years of searching, they catch a break.
They had picked up this Belgian war criminal.
He was a former Dutch SS officer called Willem Sassen.
Sassen is a former drinking buddy of Mengele.
And they said to him, we're going to take you back for war crimes unless you give us something better. He said, I'll give you Mengele.
Sassen was very much plugged into the network, and he suggested that Mengele was in Brazil. And so Aharoni and his team went there.
He said he might been hiding in a house near Sao Paulo.
But identifying the fugitive Nazi won't be easy.
He changed his name more than once and had a relatively low profile. One of his distinguishing features was this gap between his teeth, and he was nervous about that, knowing that it was an identifying feature. He grew a big, bushy mustache that effectively covered the front teeth and made it difficult for anyone to see this gap.
The team narrows their search to a ranch on the outskirts of the city. For the stakeout, Aharoni is joined by fellow agent Rafi Eitan, the man who led the Eichmann mission.
We were looking for Mengele in a farm about 50 kilometers from Sao Paulo.
The Israeli spies spend days watching the ranch. The information provided by Sassen is beginning to look like another dead end. And then
I saw a man with a mustache and two people like bodyguards watching him.
And one of them, for sure, was Mengele.
Mengele was posted to Auschwitz in May of 1943. It was only a couple of months after he turned just 32 years old.
We were loaded into cattle cars. People were praying, crying.
He's standing at the ramps when the trains pull in. He wanted to be there to select the people to the right and to the left, those who would live and those who would die.
the strongest would be chosen for slave labor. Young children, the old and the infirm, would be sent straight to the gas chambers.
And everybody understood that there was no longer any escape.
He was looking for his experiment victims. What Mengele wanted were twins.
One of the best ways of establishing how genes work is to look at identical twins.
One you do the experiments on, the other is the control you do nothing on, and you can see the changes and measure them one against the other.
He'd inject different colored pigment into their eyes.
he would use the twins to try to unlock this secret of what he viewed as the twin birth. And that involved, in some cases, the shooting of twins in the back of the head and then dissecting them as the corpses to see what was going on.
It's not like, he was just the sort of surgical murderer. He was also a brute as well.
My mother grabbed my twin sister and me by the hand, hoping that as long as she could hold on to us, that she could protect us. I, in my childish curiosity, looked around, trying to figure out what on earth is that place. Then I realized that my father and my two older sisters have disappeared in the crowd. A Nazi was running, yelling in German, "Twins, twins." We were wearing, as always, matching outfits. In this case, it was burgundy dresses. He demanded to know from my mother if we were twins. And my mother didn't know what to say. She asked if that was good. The Nazi nodded yes, and my mother said yes. I remember looking back and seeing her arms stretched out in despair as she was pulled away. I never got to say goodbye to her.
The Israelis went out and they looked at that farm, they staked it out, and Zvi Aharoni, the head of the Mossad team, told me these men walked past him, and one of them he was convinced was Mengele.
After 18 years on the run, it appears the angel of death is in the crosshairs of the Mossad. Mossad operatives believe they have sighted the world's most notorious Nazi fugitive.
I'm sure that we did see actually Mengele.
For now, the team's mission is limited to surveillance. They return to Israel to plan their next move. Agent Zvi Aharoni reports to Mossad chief Isser Harel.
Harel didn't believe their intelligence. Aharoni said as a field agent that he felt as though the man he saw was Mengele, and that was enough, therefore, to go. But what Harel was saying to him is, guess what? This is 1961. It's now 16 years after the end of the war. You're making a visual identification based upon somebody's SS photograph, which was taken in 1938. I need more evidence.
Harel says, the operation's cancelled. We've got something else to do, and there were greater problems back at home.
Because Nasser, head of Egypt, had just fired rockets capable of hitting Israel, and German rocket scientists were down there working on them. And Isser Harel spent the next year on an assassination plot of killing off the rocket scientists.
Operation Mengele is shelved. The Mossad's Nazi hunting unit is quietly disbanded.
And Mengele lived.
But the Nazi doctor is no longer enjoying the good life.
After 1959, when he had to flee Argentina because of the extradition request, his life went into a very sharp decline.
Mengele was growing increasingly paranoid that he was going to be caught. He's living a very nervous life.
Josef Mengele has no idea that the Mossad have given up their chase. He remains terrified that, like Adolf Eichmann, he will be kidnapped and hanged for his crimes.
He ended up on these little outback farms in the wilds of Brazil.
He does build a watchtower in one of these farms he lives in, and he uses it to sort of survey, the surrounding acres and kilometers around. That's his very commanding position. And he also had this whole pack of dogs with him. So he was a very, very paranoid, very edgy figure.
Israel may have given up the hunt, but in West Germany, prosecutors continue to build a case against Mengele.
There's a very loyal retainer of the Mengele family called Sedlmayr.
Prosecutors suspect Hans Sedlmayr has provided Mengele support since his flight from Europe.
A judge who was then running the office that would investigate Mengele decided to go ahead and swear Hans Sedlmayr in under sworn oath and question him about whether he was supporting Mengele, the family was, money was going to him, or anything else. Sedlmayr lied just through his teeth, said we'd never seen him, don't know anything about him, probably dead, don't send him a penny. And they never went out to find out anything else. They accepted his word.
Mengele's long flight is now nearly 20 years in the making.
Auschwitz is liberated in January 45, but before that happens, Mengele's made good his escape.
But he got away 10 days before the Red Army liberated the camp. It was complete and utter chaos. Tens of thousands of prisoners moving through the camps at the same time. Nobody quite sure of who was anybody.
He fled with a suitcase full of his scientific findings.
And he was picked up finally by the Americans in June of 1945. What saved him was that Mengele's vanity. When he had joined the SS, one of the things you had to do was have a blood type tattoo put under your arms.
So that if they were wounded and unconscious, they would know what kind of blood for transfusions. He was fastidious, narcissistic, and he didn't want a tattoo, apparently.
Mengele didn't want to mar his body.
So he never had that distinguishing feature of an SS man or officer, and that really helped him.
So in the days at the end of the war, and they had quite a simple litmus test. Take off your shirts, raise your hands. If they found a tattoo, they put you to one side and they would interrogate you. If there was no tattoo and you had some kind of reasonable story, then you were released, which is what happened with him.
Mengele drifted homeward through Germany.
Mengele did not go back and live openly under his own name in his hometown. He lived under an assumed name on a farm in Bavaria,
where he works for 2 to 3 years.
American investigators show up at his wife's home and say, do you know what happened to your husband? And she says, I hear he's dead on the Eastern Front. And they close the file.
But Mengele's family knows that he is alive and well. They even sent him money via Hans Sedlmayr.
He came from a very rich family. The Mengele family were a family who produced farm machinery in Germany.
The Mengele family ran the largest business in Günzburg. Günzburg was a company town.
But as long as Dr. Mengele stays in Germany, he remains at risk.
He was living in fear of being arrested. He saw what happened to, the Nazis in the Nuremberg trials, where all the Nazi leaders were tried, convicted, and executed by hanging. He knew, as a former Auschwitz doctor, that this could very probably be his fate if he was caught.
So he contacts his family back in Günzburg, and Sedlmayr puts him in touch with various people who can help him.
If you had enough money, you could flee.
So he crossed into Austria. From Austria, he crossed into Italy.
And like many other Nazis, he reaches Genoa.
He got an Argentine landing permit in the name of Helmut Gregor. He boarded a ship called the North King to Buenos Aires.
Mengele arrived in Argentina in August 1949. Before long, he begins selling farm machinery across South America. His business thrives.
From 49 till 59, those 10 years he spent in Argentina were actually very good years.
But after fellow SS officer Adolf Eichmann is kidnapped and indicted, Mengele's world begins to crumble.
And let me tell you, there is nothing that scared the Nazi war criminals in South America more than that indictment. It ruined everybody's day, and it especially ruined Mengele's.
He's just going from a succession of farms, being an itinerant farm manager, effectively, in Paraguay, in Brazil. And at one point when he was on a farm in Brazil, there was a young calf, had a hernia. And Mengele got out his surgical tools and performed this incredibly delicate and successful operation on removing this hernia. And the farm workers realized that actually you're not just some Swiss farm manager you claim to be. You're something else.
Though the Mossad has failed to capture him, Mengele's carefree life is gone for good.
So Mengele grows increasingly isolated, depressed, and he ends up in a very modest bungalow on the outskirts of Sao Paulo.
Ironically, as Mengele's fortunes dwindle, his legend grows increasingly outlandish.
Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, the reputation of Mengele grows out of all proportion. It's partly fueled by Simon Wiesenthal, who has kind of made Josef Mengele his sort of poster boy. You know, this is the Nazi we all want to capture. This is the really bad one. This is Angel of Death.
Private individuals such as Simon Wiesenthal, you know, the Klarsfelds in Paris, they were the ones who were keeping the flame alive.
We had known that Mengele was living in Paraguay, and that's the reason I demonstrated it in front of the Ministry of Justice in order to get information about the fate of Mengele.
The Klarsfelds did try to look for him, but probably a bit too late in the day. And a lot of people remained absolutely convinced that Mengele was in Paraguay all the way through the late 60s and 70s. And in fact, he had left Paraguay.
Everyone had this notion of Mengele living in some jungle fortress with, you know, dogs yapping at his boots and cigarette boats out on the river and minions following him around.
You've got the Mengele of popular culture, boys from Brazil, the white suit, the all-powerful Nazi hiding in the jungle, the real stuff of myth.
We thought Hollywood was doing documentaries instead of films.
It turns out he lived a fairly squalid life.
And he's got this terrible nervous habit of chewing the ends of his moustache. And he chews his moustache so much that he ends up with a hairball. His paranoid nature gets worse and worse. He's not a Nazi hiding in the jungle with a huge estate. He's a little old man with a hairball.
40 years have passed since the fall of the Third Reich. But Josef Mengele, doctor of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, remains at large.
There are sightings everywhere of Mengele, saying that he was in southern Spain, he was an island in Greece, he was in a Paraguayan jungle with a great big factory, he was everywhere but the moon, frankly. But no one was really hunting for him.
If there had been any serious effort, particularly by the German government, to find these criminals, it would have been extremely easy to find them and locate them and have them arrested.
This was a Nazi war criminal living in South America, communicating regularly with his family and getting money from them. And all they had to do was look at the mail, and they never did it.
I trusted the government of the world to do the right thing until I realized that they were covering up on left and on right.
In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Eva Kor leads a small group of survivors to the concentration camp they were sent to as children. From Auschwitz, they travel to Jerusalem, where they hold a 3-day mock trial of Dr. Mengele. 106 victims line up to testify against their Nazi tormentor.
I would say that it's probably the closest thing to making feel a person like an animal, like a nothing, like a piece of garbage or a piece of meat.
He would come every morning immaculately dressed. I remember his black, gleaming boots.
He had this white coat, and he was handsome, and he wore the uniform. He was this immensely powerful figure.
I was injected with something that made me very ill.
He would deliberately infect them to see how long the infection would take in one and not the other.
I had extremely high fever. My arms, my legs were swollen to twice the size with huge red patches all over. Painful, very painful.
Mengele's twisted desire to create an Aryan master race led to torturous experiments on more than 3,000 twins. 200 survived.
So when Mengele came in with the 4 other doctors, and he looked at the fever chart, and he declared, laughing sarcastically, "Zu schwer, too young, 2 Wochen to labor. Too bad. She's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live." That much I understood in German.
Against the odds, Eva and her sister Miriam lived to see the Red Army's liberation of Auschwitz. The rest of their family perished.
To me, it seemed like a nightmare, that somehow if I could close my eyes and open them up again, the whole nightmare would disappear. But the nightmare did not disappear.
In 1985, campaigning by Eva Kor and others converges with political will.
The pressure is building on the German government, on the Americans, on the Israelis because of this mock trial. There started to be multi-million-dollar rewards offered for Mengele.
Law enforcement officials from 3 nations meet to coordinate their efforts.
The Germans were the hosts. There were several people from different agencies in Israel, and the U.S. Marshal Service was there.
Days later, the international team decides to act on a promising tip. After drinking heavily at a restaurant, Mengele's fixer, Hans Settelmeyer, let it slip to a friend that he's been supporting Mengele for years. The friend alerted authorities. The chief prosecutor in Frankfurt secures a search warrant for Settelmeyer's home.
Settelmeyer was always considered to be a potential link to Mengele in South America.
The hunt for the Nazi doctor moves into high gear. May 31st, 1985. German special agents raid the home of Mengele family fixer Hans Settelmeyer.
They knew that if they told the local Bavarian police, there was bound to be an informer for the Mengele family who would then tip them off and, make sure they hid everything. So they got a different police force from another part of the country to go and raid Settelmeyer's property.
The search was conducted by the Bundeskriminalamt, which is the German federal police.
They do this search. He thinks he's safe. It's only by luck, when they move this large sort of armoire cabinet, that they find something.
Behind the furniture, investigators unearth a secret stash of envelopes.
There they found these letters that had been sent from Mengele.
They found everything. All the letters, all the addresses of his helpers.
Long had been rumored the fact that Settelmeyer's wife had a crush on Josef Mengele early on. And Mengele had letters to her directly as well as to Hans Settelmeyer.
Among the cache of letters, investigators find one that includes a stunning revelation. With deep sorrow, I tell you of the death of our common friend.
That led the Germans to believe that Mengele had died in Brazil in 1979.
Settelmeyer is arrested. A search of his address book links Mengele to a residence in Sao Paulo. David Marwell, an investigator with the U.S. Justice Department, is part of the international force now hunting Mengele.
The Germans, after the discovery of the documentation in the Settelmeyer home, went directly to Sao Paulo.
Brazilian police are brought on board.
Romeo Tuma was the captain who ran the Brazilian investigation for the federal police. He received the material from the Germans.
Tuma quickly determines who lives at the Sao Paulo address. A German family called the Bosserts.
They're there, they're not quite so genteel about a search warrant. They really do come in with full force.
Police question them about their suspected link to Mengele.
And they refused to give anything up. They said, no, it's not Mengele, it's not true. They lied, they denied it.
But Tuma soon finds a makeshift shrine to Mengele and a stash of his personal writing and photographs. The truth about one of the era's most enduring mysteries is finally revealed.
And finally, they gave it up.
The family admit to sheltering Mengele during the last 4 years of his life.
And then they said where he was dead, and then where they had buried him. Mengele is buried just outside on the outskirts of a common cemetery where paupers are generally buried.
And they dug up a 6-year-old corpse.
News of Mengele's death attracts a media throng to the gravesite.
And there was Mengele's skull for everybody to see, and it was kind of held up for the cameras in a rather grisly way, and snap, snap, snap.
But questions linger.
There were many who believed that he could have staged a death, and he had the requisite medical knowledge and clearly the motive to stage a death.
Because he had this diabolical reputation, because he had this image that he was this cunning scientist beyond, any form of natural justice, he was, this was all just some cunning thing. Even though Mengele's bones had been dug up, a lot of people thought that Mengele was still alive.
An international task force from Germany, Brazil, Israel, and America believe they have found Josef Mengele. Forensic scientists must now prove the exhumed corpse really is the Nazi doctor.
We put together a top-flight team of pathologists and of radiologists and dental experts. The Israelis sent down the chief pathologist of the Israeli Defense Force. The forensic experts set out to compare what they knew about the living Mengele with what evidence could be derived from the skeletonized remains.
So they had compared the skull to a picture of Mengele's face, and they blended the two together. So it's very eerie, but very compelling as a piece of evidence.
We spent a great deal of time examining the bones that were discovered in this grave, and I am absolutely confident that the bones were Josef Mengele's.
But for undeniable proof, they would have to wait for the advent of a new forensic technology.
There was a lot of room for the doubters to think that actually maybe he's, still around. Maybe this is all a fix. And it did take really genetic testing in the early 90s to fundamentally prove to people that these were indeed Mengele's bones.
Science caught up with the Mengele case. Bones from Brazil were sent to a laboratory in England. They were ground, and they were able to collect a tiny amount of DNA, enough to analyze it.
The results are definitive. The bones are Josef Mengele's.
There he was dead.
The hunt for Josef Mengele is over. The full details of how he died are revealed.
Mengele's death was, in many ways, pitiful, and it was kind of the pitiful death that he deserved. With some friends, he was taken down to Bertioga Beach, which is about 20 or 30 miles just south of Sao Paulo, and they sat in their sort of beach house they had, a little beach house. They persuaded him, look, why don't you go out for a swim? Mengele always refused to go outside because oh, I don't like the sun, and also he thought he might be spotted by someone. And he eventually said, okay, I will. Current was very, very strong, as it is round there.
On this hot summer day, Mengele swam out from the beach a little bit further than he should have.
And it became quite apparent within a few minutes that he was in trouble. Tried to resuscitate him. He had had a stroke, and if you have a stroke while you're swimming, the combination isn't great.
And he dies in the water, either from drowning or from the stroke itself.
The interesting thing is that after his death, they talked about whether they should cremate him. They couldn't get anyone in the Mengele family to sign off on it. They wanted to cremate the remains. If they had done that, nobody today, including me, would think he's dead.
The world's most notorious Nazi fugitive would never answer for his crimes.
They would have loved to have had that trial for the historical record for Mengele. The victims deserved that, and that was frustrating for the Mossad.
Israel sometimes apologizes why he didn't succeed to bring Mengele into trial. When I write my memory, I'm not going to apologize.
There's no punishment for a fellow like Mengele. Even if he's caught and he's executed, the second at the end of the hangman's noose isn't justice for what he did. But there is some justice in that after the Eichmann kidnapping, he is really a bitter, depressed, unhappy man. That gives me great satisfaction.
I think in many ways I feel sorry for people like Josef Mengele, because they had a twisted idea of what is right and what is wrong. I don't believe that the perpetrators escaped scot-free. I think they lived a miserable life filled with guilt.
If you're looking for shards of justice in all this, he didn't lead the life that many fantasized he did. This was not a comfortable life.
Mengele died an old man. And the hell with him.
Kurt Lischka was in charge of annihilating a people.
It was a death factory, basically. It was a death factory.
There was no will to bring the Nazi criminals to justice.
The Klarsfelds believe in action.
We had to do something.
There were plots in Germany to kill us.
Nothing would stop them.
Cologne, West Germany. Political activists Serge and Beate Klausfeld stake out an apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. It is home to Nazi war criminal Kurt Lischka.
It is 100% Lischka's job to organize the arrests, deportation, and their ferrying of the Jews east, which of course is that great Nazi euphemism for exterminating people in camps such as Auschwitz.
A legal loophole protects Nazis like Lischka from prosecution in Germany. The Klausfelds are on a mission to change the law and make Lischka pay for his crimes.
We had learned that most of the Nazi criminals who had been active in the deportation of the Jews of France had remained in Germany under their own names.
We were very outraged by the fact that they became judges, businessmen, high officials.
They wanted to force the Germans to see that they had in their midst a major Nazi criminal.
The husband and wife team have traveled from their home in Paris to track down the war criminal.
Beate called information in Cologne and had no problem immediately getting an address for Kurt Lischka.
Kurt Lischka, this and this number, and his address, Bergisch Gladbacher Straße. You know, it was as easy as this.
For Serge, this isn't just about politics. A French Jew, he lost family in the Holocaust.
We saw him leaving to go to work as an accountant. He was a businessman.
But 30 years ago, Lischka had a very different job. As Gestapo chief in Paris, he orchestrated the murder of 33,000 Jews.
He sent out to Paris, where he heads up the Jewish Affairs Department. And that doesn't mean looking after Jews. That means effectively killing them.
He organized the arrest of Jews in France and their deportation to Auschwitz.
And that's his job. He's in charge of annihilating a people.
After the war, he fell in the hands of the Czech authorities. They released him in 1950.
He went back to live in Germany, and he lived quietly with his family and tried to get on with a normal life.
He was a prosperous German businessman.
It's extraordinary to think that someone could have gone from exterminating people to living this sort of upper middle class life, but that was the way it was.
In recent years, Lischka has prospered. He is now a finance executive for a grain shipping company in Cologne.
He was sending grains exactly like Jews. He was sending grains. It's the same work as sending Jews.
The next morning, the Klausfelds are back on Lischka's street. This time they've hired a cameraman to try to capture the Nazi on film.
The Klausfelds found out where he would walk on his way to the streetcar. He had to take the streetcar to get to work in Cologne.
Lischka is not scuttling under rocks. Lischka is living very openly.
And suddenly, we saw a tall man. He was wearing a black coat, carrying a briefcase, and was smoking a cigarette. Serge said, "Yes, that's him."
It is the start of a dramatic cat-and-mouse chase that will last almost 9 years.
We filmed Lischka when he went out from his apartment.
I started shooting him from one angle to keep him in the frame as long as possible. I was following him, walking right beside him.
Lischka started to run.
So I started running too. I kept one eye on the street. My right eye was on the viewfinder, trying to focus on him.
We didn't want to do something against him, but he believes that perhaps we will.
He hid his face behind his briefcase, and you can see on the tape that he glanced at me.
Well, they certainly became his worst nightmare when, in the famous footage, you see the great head of the Gestapo of Paris running like a squirrel, being chased by a dog.
It was clear to me that this man was a criminal. You could tell by the way he acted.
He was fearful of the truth that they brought. It was the truth that was pursuing him, not the Klarsfelds. It was the truth of his crimes.
We shot until he got onto the streetcar.
And so we had a very good material of Nazi criminals running in the street in Cologne.
The Klarsfelds hope their film of Lischka will help sway German public opinion. Hunting down Nazi war criminals has become their life's work.
He was this very intelligent, intense young lawyer, and she was an au pair, but she had a very good brain. Serge sort of opened up Beata's eyes to what had happened during the war.
Beata came to see that as a German, it was her destiny with Serge to force Germany to look at its past.
And their life since then has just been one long, very, very hardly fought campaign against injustice.
In Germany especially, the couple face enormous obstacles.
During this time, the German state networks and legal apparatuses are still riddled with people who are not that interested in hunting Nazis, either because they themselves have something about their own past to hide or they know someone.
In fact, Kurt Lischka has already been convicted of war crimes, not in Germany but in France in 1950. Remarkably, as long as he stays in Germany, he's safe.
People like Lischka were allowed to remain free because there was no framework agreed between the French and Germans on how to get some of these criminals into France to be tried.
The Klarsfelds want to shame Germany into adopting a new law, one that will punish war criminals like Lischka. They released their film to the media,
which were shown in many TV all over Germany and Western world.
But the public outrage they're hoping for never comes.
Nothing happened, there was silence. And I said, you know, you have to react.
Frustrated with government inertia, the Klarsfelds decide on a more radical move.
The Klarsfelds, in their typical fashion, decide that there's only one thing to do with Lischka, and that's not to write letters to members of parliament or lawyers, is to take direct action. These are children of the 60s after all, and they like to stage a happening.
We decided that we will try to kidnap him in order to bring him back to France.
They're going to take him back to France, and they're going to present him to the French authorities and go, right, there, do something about it.
The idea that they would try to kidnap an ex-Gestapo chief, it was mind-blowing. It really was.
But to carry out their audacious plan, they need help. Eli is a photographer whose mother died in Auschwitz. Marco is a friend from university. And David is a doctor whose judo skills may prove useful.
And we told them, are you ready to come with us? And we explained the case. And they say yes.
None of them were prepared emotionally or physically, and I think it was only Serge's very strong, persuasive personality that got them on board in the first place.
Beata briefs the recruits on Lischka's daily routine. She has spent days in Cologne spying on him.
He left in the morning to go to his business and then coming back at noon for lunch at home and going back to his office.
But we understood that it will not be easy. We knew if we will succeed, we will bring him in front of the Ministry of Police in Paris. If we do not succeed, it will be a case which will mobilize public opinion in Germany.
The team travels to Cologne. They rehearse the abduction and finalize last-minute details. But the plan hits a snag when the rental car they've booked isn't available.
They want to rent a car. They've been promised they'll get a certain type which has 4 doors, and when they arrive, the car has only got 2 doors. A 2-door car is the worst type of car you can imagine trying to bundle someone into, especially someone very tall like Lischka. You can't just shove him in.
It's the first sign of trouble. The day of the kidnap, the team moves into position.
I was, you know, a volunteer in the Israeli army in '67, so I was not afraid by the action.
The idea was, once they had stuffed Lischka into the trunk, they would drive out to the outskirts of Cologne and transfer him to another rented car so that they couldn't be spotted or identified along the way back to France.
They understood that it was now the moment to go after him, you know.
They had the plan. What they didn't have were the personnel who could really carry it out. Somebody really to thwonk Lischka hard on the head.
They're not exactly professional kidnappers.
At the critical moment, Eli loses his nerve and freezes.
I don't think they wanted to go back to France saying, we didn't have the courage to carry out our plan. So having failed once, maybe that bolstered their courage.
In a nearby cafe, Serge rallies his troops. He reminds them why they're here. Kurt Lischka and hundreds of Nazis like him must face justice.
The situation was the same situation for all the Nazi criminals who acted in France, and we wanted to change that situation.
For Serge, in the back of his mind were the screams and the moans of children who first were subjected to terrible arrest, then to an inhuman trip to Auschwitz, and finally to the gas chamber. And Lischka, more than anyone else, was central to that happening in France.
In May 1942, Lischka decreed that all Jews over the age of 6 wear the Yellow Star of David. 2 months later, he ordered the largest mass arrest in French history.
Thousands of Jews were arrested during the great roundup of the Vélodrome d'Hiver on July 16, 1942. 13,000 Jews, among them 4,000 children.
More than half of the victims rounded up that day died at Auschwitz.
If it wouldn't be for the fact that we were not arrested on that day, I would never have seen my 13th birthday.
Simon Jerukum was only saved through the quick action of his father and mother.
She took it upon herself to walk to our cleaning woman who lived in the neighborhood, not very far, and she begged her to have, if we could just stay overnight in her house. I remember that moment because I was looking at my mother, and I still feel to this day, I remember I felt embarrassed that my mother was crying in front of a stranger. And all we were told, you're going to be placed with farmers, they will not know you're Jewish, you have to pretend you're Catholic. I left the house, and that's the last time I saw them. That was the very last time.
I feel that part of myself was in a way arrested. And I share the fate of all those who were arrested and disappeared.
Serge is determined to make the Nazi murderer pay a price. At 12:45 p.m., he leads a second kidnap attempt.
So they go up to Lischka, and in the street, this very tall guy.
We came close to him. One took one hand, one arm, another one took a second arm.
And he's shocked. I mean, as you would be if just some random bloke came and jumped out at you.
And he was very heavy, and it was very difficult to push him. And he started to shout, Hilfe, Hilfe, help, help.
Hits him again, and Lischka sort of collapses to the ground. Not unconscious at all, but just, a little bit dazed and stunned.
He were beating him, he went down on the ground. We were shouting.
They then tried to manhandle Lischka into the car. And it's at this point that things go very badly wrong for the team. A policeman has suddenly spotted them.
We ran to the car in order to escape the policeman.
Lischka shouting, I want my hat, I want my hat. And that's all that Lischka and the policeman seem to be worried about. It's sort of high farce almost.
We left for France, and Beata remained behind because she was on the other part of the street. We knew that she could come back by herself.
I don't think they really thought they were going to cross the border into France with Lischka in the trunk of the car. But they knew they were going to cause embarrassment to the authorities.
The Klarsfelds don't have their man, but they hope the bungled abduction will hit the headlines. To their disappointment, the following day, there is barely a mention.
There was very few, and the next day a small article that a man was attacked in the street.
So we called the newspapers. Beata called, like if she was a neighbor of Lischka. How is it possible that nothing is written while this poor Mr. Lischka was put on the ground and attacked by foreigners?
I said, you know, these were French Jews who came to kidnap the former police, the chief of the Gestapo in France.
The next day, it was full of news because the police was obliged to say that, yes, there was an attempt of kidnapping.
Beata decides to go one step further. She returns to Cologne and claims responsibility for the crime.
So the police came and she presented herself as one of the kidnappers.
So immediately Beata say, I organized that attempt of kidnapping because Germany doesn't want to ratify the treaty between France and Germany, and Kurt Lischka was our first attempt.
The police didn't want to arrest her. They understood something was happening here, which was in effect a manipulation of the police.
If Germany won't put a mass murderer behind bars, then Beata will sacrifice her own freedom. March 31st, 1971. Beata Klarsfeld is back in Cologne. She wants to force the authorities to act against the former Gestapo chief of Paris.
It's one thing just to say he was head of this department in Paris during the war, but you've also got to have a paper trail, and you've got to show quite what this man has done, and you've got to show bits of paper with his name and initials on and so on.
Part of the documents concerning the Jews had remained here in France when the German retired.
We had a very solid and heavy file against Lischka.
As they read the documentation of the deportation period, his name was just all over every telex to Eichmann in Berlin. He was what they called the desk murderer.
My parents, they were actually trying to go to the non-occupied, what they call the free zone, and they were arrested on the border. And they were sent immediately to Auschwitz. So they were actually gassed in September. I mean, just a month and a half after we were separated. Thinking of them being so young, they were in their early 40s, you know. I didn't want to think about the suffering. This is too much for me to imagine.
It was intolerable to them that criminals of that level should go on unrevenged. Justice had to be meted out to Lischka.
In the company of Holocaust survivors, Beata delivers their dossier on Lischka to the prosecutor in Cologne.
We met the prosecutor of the Lischka case and delivered him the documents, and I said, you know, here I am. I say to you, we wanted to kidnap Lischka. We could not succeed, but I bring in anyway the file about him.
Beata deliberately presents the prosecutor with a dilemma.
If he will arrest Beata, that will make a mobilization among the victims. And if he will not arrest Beata, it will show that the German justice is unable to arrest people who act illegally, like the Nazi criminals.
The best situation for the Klarsfelds was that Lischka would continue to go about his normal life, and Beata would be thrown in jail.
Now, the authorities do act. They don't arrest Lischka. They arrest Beata Klarsfeld.
Beata spends the next 2 weeks in Ossendorf prison.
And every moment of that time was well worth it to the Klarsfelds because it embarrassed the official powers. This young woman is in jail, and this top Nazi is walking around.
Beate and I decided to oblige the German parliament to make a law giving the possibility to judge these criminals.
But Serge knows that shaming politicians may not be enough.
There were powerful men, of course, against such a law giving the possibility to judge Nazi criminals in Germany.
There was no appetite in Germany to go around soul-searching by, arresting people like Lischka and bringing them to trial. There was just no demand for it.
The injustice of Beate's incarceration becomes a cause célèbre.
All the newspapers in France made huge articles.
There are massive protests organized by Serge, free Beate.
Without any powers of their own, other than their own courage, it's amazing to think that they found ways to use the press to affirm their moral position.
The authorities caved to public pressure and released Beate on bail.
They upped the ante. They dramatized justice and injustice.
But for the Klausfelds, the harder they fight to bring Nazis to justice, the more danger they face from those determined to stop them.
One day in their Paris apartment, they had received a parcel, seemingly full of chocolates from an admirer.
It was sent by somebody called Seagal, a Jewish name, but the initial of the first name and the name were SS.
Serge was very suspicious.
So Serge opened carefully the paper, and inside was a box of candy, and in the paper were some black grains.
Luckily, the Beate and the children were away.
A box of candy, which in fact was a bomb, had been sent to them.
So I took the parcel to the police.
So he put it in a plastic shopping bag and walked it down to the police station. And then one of his friends said, "Hey, what do you got in there, Serge?" And he goes, "Hey, I've got a bomb." And the police examine it, and they say, "You are lucky to be alive."
They discovered 300 grams of dynamite and 500 grams of nails.
This is half a kilo of high explosives that would have just torn you, the flat, completely to bits. So, indeed, the Klausfelds are very lucky.
There were plots by extreme rightists in Germany to kill us.
They put their lives, their bodies on the line willingly.
These are threats. We took them seriously, but we never stopped.
May 1973. Beate ups the ante again. 7 months pregnant and flanked by Auschwitz survivors, she marches into Lischka's office to stage a protest.
She was never frightened. She was never, ever frightened.
Now, confronted by his accusers, the modern business executive reveals his true Gestapo colors.
He took a gun to put one of the demonstrators against the wall.
Did he hate the Klarsfelds? He certainly was fearful of them.
He wouldn't have done this without the fact that he was afraid of being punished. Slowly, with our demonstrative actions, we put pressure on the German society.
The Klarsfelds are really savvy manipulators, and they knew how to present a really good image to the public.
They wanted Germany to deal with Lischka.
That was our strategy.
Serge himself was a child of the Holocaust. I believe he was 8 years old when his father was taken away.
It was September 1943. The Gestapo burst into Serge's home. He, along with his sister and mother, hid in a secret compartment inside their closet.
And they started to look for us, and one German opened the door of the closet, and he put aside all the clothes like that, but he didn't touch the wood. And in the morning, when the Germans were no more there, we escaped.
The young Serge didn't know what had happened to his father.
We phoned to the German prosecutor saying, you know, if you do nothing in order to judge these criminals, one day somebody will come with an armed weapon and kill Lischka.
Despite the pressure, there is still no movement among German lawmakers. In December 1973, 3 years after their hunt began, Serge can wait no longer. He will take the law into his own hands.
Serge traveled alone with a pistol to Cologne.
I knew that the threat of killing Nazi criminals will not be believed until we would show it effectively.
If he couldn't get justice through the court system, he would finally have to administer justice himself.
I waited Lischka to go out from his office, to go to his car. When he arrived to his car, I, by surprise, arrived with a gun.
Serge took that pistol and shoved it in his face.
He was shouting and afraid.
Lischka! I put the gun on his head.
Lischka's eyes bulged out.
He immediately believed that he will be killed.
Just like his victims 30 years earlier, Kurt Lischka is forced to stare death in the face. One of those victims was Serge's father, Arno Klarsfeld. Like thousands of other French Jews, he was deported on the Gestapo chief's orders.
He was sent to Auschwitz. He survived until August 1944, and then he died.
Lischka was the single major figure in the murder of French Jews who was still alive and still could be punished, and if no one else was going to do it, then he would do it.
I decided that I did not survive for nothing.
Lischka thought he was about to die.
Lischka! I decided not to kill because that would be an act of despair. I didn't shoot. I smiled, I laughed, and I left running.
Shoving a revolver between the eyes of Kurt Lischka was a symbolic murder. And this was his way of saying, we want justice, we don't want revenge.
Serge went back to Paris, and again, then we phoned to the German prosecutors.
I told them, you see, if we want to kill these criminals, we can, even with a gun, even protected, and it will happen if you do not do your duty.
Eventually, after much toing and froing and a lot of pressure from the Klausfelds, eventually the law is passed.
We obtained finally the ratification.
It was done in January 1975.
5 years after their campaign began, the new law is enacted. It is dubbed the Klausfeld Law, in recognition of their tireless effort. But their fight is far from over. Lischka and other Nazi criminals must now be brought to judgment.
We were leading a war against these Nazi criminals.
They had found a way to use their own ingenuity, their own courage, their own lack of fear about what might happen to them to accomplish great things.
July 1978, 2 years after the Klausfeld Law was passed, German police arrest Kurt Lischka for the murder of 33,000 French Jews.
I think the most important was that these men we had confronted before at this time never thought that one day they would be judged.
So it became possible to have a trial in Cologne.
At that time, we were very, very happy.
The forthcoming trial stirs up a real hornet's nest of neo-Nazi activity against the Klausfelds.
During the night, we heard an explosion, and Beat told me what it is. I believe it's our car.
In the garage at the bottom of the apartment block where the Klausfelds live, the car is blown to pieces by a car bomb. Subsequent investigations revealed that the car bomb was intended to go off when Serge was driving his daughter to school. So this was actually an act of attempted murder. It says so much of the bravery of the Klausfelds that doesn't stop them.
If you are obsessed with security, you cannot do anything.
October 23rd, 1979. The Kurt Lischka trial opens.
Even though Lischka have been brought to trial, the Klausfelds don't end it there. I mean, they never say never. They decide that the best way to help impress upon the German public the severity of the crimes he's being tried for, they have a lot of former French concentration camp inmates turning up wearing their concentration camp uniforms with the yellow Star of David on it.
Also on trial for war crimes are Lischka's deputy, Ernst Heinrichsen, and Herbert Hagen, a high-ranking SS leader in wartime France.
They brought in the 3 defendants and put them in kind of a fenced-in area. And they looked like 3 businessmen. They had looks on their faces like, oh, why are you doing this to us? You know, what is this all about? We're not criminals.
For the verdict, the Klausfelds pull one last stunt. They charter a special train from France carrying 1,500 Jews.
It was the trains and the cattle wagons that took the Jews eastwards from France through Germany and to the extermination camps. This train was seen as a highly symbolic act of bringing a train of Jews, French Jews, into Germany for the trial.
was a big march through the streets of Cologne. The youngsters were staying outside and shouting, Lischka murder, Hagen murder.
French Jews who had been powerless suddenly felt, yes, we are a people.
9 years after the Klausfelds first staked out Kurt Lischka's apartment, all 3 defendants are found guilty.
I think catching those murderers is something that people like myself, is here for my generation, would feel a great deal of, I would say the word joy. You know, justice had been served in some ways.
Nobody would ever have identified the principles of the final solution in France if it weren't for the Klausfelds.
And Lischka was sentenced to 10 years of jail.
Although Lischka is sentenced for 10 years, he in fact only serves 5 years, and he's released in the mid-1980s on grounds of ill health, and he dies in a nursing home.
The Lischka trial was for us the trial of those who lived unpunished in Germany during more than 30 years, and eventually were sentenced by a new Germany.
With our work, we obliged them to do something what they didn't want.
It's very hard to imagine the depth of commitment of this couple. They were bonded together in a commitment unto death, if that's what it took.
The crimes are never forgotten. At the very end, these criminals can be judged for the crimes they had committed.
France's worst villain, hounding Jews, persecuting Jews.
Paul Touvier sent my mother to Auschwitz.
Members of the Catholic Church who were pro-Nazi helped him escape.
My job is to arrest Mr. Touvier.
Finding the man is not going to be easy.
They searched a number of monasteries.
We were stepping into a sacred place.
When I started, nothing could stop me.
World War II has been over for 43 years. Yet France's most notorious war criminal is still at large. A Nazi collaborator who murdered Jews and resistance fighters alike, Paul Touvier. Now, a high-ranking French detective has the job of hunting him down.
It was in March 1988 when a magistrate of the Paris court gave me the Touvier case.
Colonel Raccordant is someone who's very determined. When he decides to do something, he'll do everything he can to make it happen.
Il met tous les moyens pour y aboutir.
Over the years, the French National Police have tried and failed to bring the war criminal to justice. But Colonel Jean-Louis Recordon has a hard-won reputation as a tough and skilled investigator. His latest mission is top secret.
For roughly 40 years, Touvier was hidden somewhere, and nobody was able to arrest him.
Combing through the Touvier case files, Recordon is transported back to one of the darkest periods in French history. When the Nazis invaded France, some Frenchmen heroically resisted. Others, like Paul Touvier, wholeheartedly collaborated.
He worked with the Germans during the war. In fact, they joined with German units to actually fight against the resistance.
As one of the leaders of a pro-Nazi paramilitary force, Touvier's job was hunting down enemies of the state.
Touvier selected 7 people, and he said himself it was because they were Jewish. They were stood up against the wall and shot. Simple as that.
He's France's worst villain.
Even in the 1980s, there are people in high places who collaborated with the Nazis. People who are sympathetic to Paul Touvier.
I was concerned about potential leaks because I was fully aware about the fact that in the French administration, but not only in the French administration, in the French society, Touvier had supporters.
When someone's been hiding for 40 years, the chances of finding him are next to nothing.
Quasi nul. I mentioned to the magistrate the fact that this case should be an impossible mission. But when I started, nothing could stop me.
For this mission impossible, Colonel Recordon teams up with seasoned investigator Dominique Bélanger.
When I received the Paul Touvier file, I knew it was very sensitive. Our division only dealt with very sensitive cases. It was a secret investigation.
I was fully blind, I would say. I have no information about his current physical appearance, of course.
The problem with searching for Paul Touvier was that we didn't even know if he was alive.
Touvier faked his own death because at some point he had put a notice in the newspaper, Paul Touvier is dead. But since there was no proof of his death, we continued with the investigation.
I started to define the Touvier networks, his relatives, his supporters, and all people mentioning in the dossier. And I was interested by one fact. I noticed several times the influence of the Catholic Church.
It has long been rumored that Paul Touvier has been sheltered by elements within the French Catholic Church.
He clearly had received some important support.
If it's true, it wouldn't be the first time that sympathetic clergy have aided and abetted Nazi fugitives.
I think members of the Catholic Church who were pro-Nazi helped people escape after the war.
The church had this tradition of standing outside the secular authority and assisting those people in trouble without asking any questions.
This part of the French story is always very controversial.
It does seem very fishy that everybody who helped the Nazis happened to be connected to the Catholic Church.
The hunt for war criminal Paul Touvier has exposed deep religious and political divisions in France that date back decades. When the Germans defeated France in 1940, they carved the nation in half. The Nazis occupied the north. In the south, they set up a puppet government based in the town of Vichy. The Vichy government created their own version of the Gestapo, the fearsome milice.
The milice was created essentially as a paramilitary police force to fight the resistance. It's an expression in its ideology of the most extreme elements in Vichy. It's overtly anti-Semitic.
And Touvier made a career in the milice, and he really took to it. And he did so well that he was promoted. He became the person in charge of intelligence gathering for the milice office.
He was an absolute ideological fanatic. The Jews and the resistance, these were enemies of France, and they were to be eliminated.
Well, after the war, there was a serious effort in France to purge French society of people who had collaborated with the Germans.
Collaborators like Paul Touvier, who was desperate to avoid the hangman's noose.
Touvier came from a devout Catholic family, and he was a devout Catholic himself. And when he looked around for help, he thought perhaps the church could help him.
I assumed the Catholic Church could be an important element to be investigated.
Recordon discovers that Touvier's last known mailing address is the Lyon Archdiocese.
We wanted to obtain the authorization to examine the archives of the Archbishop.
It was quite a delicate inquiry.
The magistrate and the detective drive 300 miles south to Lyon. They decide the magistrate will meet with the Archbishop alone to gain his trust.
We obtain a meeting with the Archbishop, but I stay outside the Archbishop office. I was very anxious. It was sensitive. The Archbishop was very reluctant to authorize the police to investigate Catholic archives.
Recordon's request to see the archive is turned down flat, only fueling his suspicions.
For me, it's an habit to meet numerous people who don't want to cooperate with me. It's not a problem for me. Okay, you don't want to cooperate directly? Okay, I will use another way.
Nine months into the investigation, Recordon is convinced that Touvier is being hidden by elements within the Catholic Church.
To remain impossible to find, to stay hidden while in France, the perfect place for this was a religious setting. Whether in monasteries or abbeys that could shelter entire families or individuals.
Police concentrate on the right-wing fundamentalist movement within the church.
We were focused mainly on one in the monastery. Due to the fact that Touvier worked for a certain time in the 70s around this monastery.
It is the Notre-Dame-des-Doms monastery in central France.
I decided to send Bélanger inside the monastery in order to find some clues of the presence of Touvier or his family.
Officer Bélanger goes undercover, posing as an ex-convict seeking charity.
We were stepping into a privileged, secretive place. It's another world, cloistered and also protected.
It was a very impenetrable system and very effective.
It's very difficult to infiltrate these religious communities. There's an element of mistrust. Very few lay people gain access. I worked there during the day and at night had the run of the abbey.
Belanger searches for clues.
Every detail we gathered motivated us.
But the undercover operation yields little.
There were several people staying at the monastery, but none of them resembled Touvier. It was demoralizing. We had to come up with another strategy.
So the team tries another tack. They tap the phones of a number of fundamentalist religious communities.
We had created a network of phone taps in every place where Paul Touvier could have been called.
Paul Touvier aurait pu être appelé, en fait. All wiretapping devices were remotely connected to the basement of my offices.
When you do phone taps, you hear many different voices. But when you listen to the same people constantly, you start to recognize voices. You know how they speak, what they're talking about, and who's there. That's the technique of phone tapping.
Dans le même temps,
and then we got a lucky break. An article appeared in a national newspaper talking about Paul Touvier's relationship with elements of the church.
By chance, an investigative reporter has also been delving into the war criminal's past. Like the police, the reporter concludes that Touvier is likely being helped by Catholic fundamentalists. The article gives investigators their first major break.
As soon as the article was published, we started overhearing phone conversations. Certain people were worried about how the press had discovered this information.
Right after the article came out, at one point, we heard a phrase we understood perfectly to be, "Our friend Paul is not going to be happy."
Notre ami Paul ne va pas être content. For me, it was marvelous, very, very nice thing. And people were saying, we have to help our friend Paul. Paul is now under surveillance. We have to take care, and so on and so on.
One call in particular offers a strong lead. On the phone is Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, the head of a renegade right-wing Catholic group called the Knights of Notre Dame. The Knights are part of the fundamentalist movement. At the other end of the line, Dom Lafont, abbot of a Benedictine monastery called Saint Paul de Wisque.
It seems that the Wisque monastery and the home of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre could be two links of the chain.
Detectives have evidence linking war criminal Paul Touvier to a monastery in northern France and a secretive far-right Catholic sect.
I decided, with the agreement of the magistrate, to launch the operation. I sent two different teams, one in Wisque in order to make an investigation in the monastery, and the other team to the home of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre.
The manhunt intensifies. Belanger arrives at the Wisque monastery, armed with a search warrant.
normal practice to enter religious institutions. We questioned Dom Lafont. He wanted to phone his superiors and tell them what was happening. He thought that would scare us.
Lafont was smiling, thinking we had no chance to find Touvier.
We conducted a search. Dom Lafont didn't believe it. Police just didn't search a convent.
Belanger grills the abbot, but Lafont insists he knows nothing of the war crime.
We said we would stay with him. We detained him for 48 hours. He realized we weren't going anywhere.
Eventually, the abbot cracks. In a startling admission, he reveals he is part of a conspiracy to protect Paul Touvier.
He puts us on to the Knights of Notre Dame.
Now detectives pull in the leader of the Catholic sect, Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, for questioning.
When Jean-Pierre Lefebvre was in the hand of an investigator for interrogation, he started to deny to know Touvier.
But the team's already discovered that Lefebvre and Touvier share a dark past. The militant religious leader once fought alongside Nazi SS officers.
In the basement of the house of Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, the investigators discovered numerous documents related to World War II.
Like Paul Touvier, Lefebvre was one of thousands of French who betrayed his country. Touvier worked closely with the notorious Klaus Barbie. Barbie was known as the Butcher of Lyon, Touvier, the Hangman of Lyon.
Klaus Barbie was the head of the intelligence branch of the Gestapo office in Lyon, and Touvier was the head of the intelligence branch of the milice office in Lyon, and they were certainly in the same line of work.
But Barbie was German. Touvier had no such excuse. He was a traitor who terrorized his own countrymen.
80,000 Jews died in France during the occupation. About 76,000 of them were deported.
His activities as a member of the milice combine hounding Jews, persecuting, chasing down Jews, fighting the resistance, but also he becomes very much of a mafia-like figure.
Vladimir Zad's mother was at a Lyon synagogue when Touvier and his henchmen showed up.
Paul Touvier come with his truck and stop in front of the synagogue Tilsit, and some men enter the synagogue. He took all Jewish people, among them my mother, and was directed to a prison in Lyon, then deported to Auschwitz.
It is crimes like this that have led detectives to question the leader of the Knights of Notre Dame about Paul Touvier.
Several hours later, the investigator came in my office saying he don't want to speak, he don't want to cooperate. It's why I decided to join the interrogation.
Recordon tries a ruse to get his witness to open up.
I made a remark saying there is other hunters who are on the track of Paul Touvier, and these people are going to work for their own interest and are very ill-intentioned regarding Paul Touvier. When I said this, Lefebvre looked at me carefully. Wiesenthal, Klarsfeld. I shrugged the shoulders. It could be.
He hopes Lefebvre will think it's safer to turn Touvier over to police than to risk Nazi hunters like the Klarsfelds or Simon Wiesenthal getting hold of him.
And I said, if something wrong happened to Touvier and his family, you will be responsible.
The ploy works. The former SS officer admits the Knights of Notre Dame have been funneling money to the war criminal.
Lefebvre told me that each month he sent 3,000 French francs, roughly $600 US, to a woman located in Paris.
Paul Touvier's flight from justice has been more than 40 years in the making. After the war, he was convicted in absentia of treason and war crimes.
Touvier, it manages to stay in hiding and to survive until the 20-year statute of limitations runs out on the charges against him. What he wanted was to be able to inherit and to move back into his father's home. Move in with his wife and children, lead a normal life, if you will.
While the charges against Touvier had expired, he was still banned from owning property in his hometown. He was keen to reclaim his property and his reputation.
The only way he could get an inheritance when his dad died was to get a presidential pardon from President Pompidou.
In the 1960s and 70s, Touvier still had friends high in the French government and clergy. After a long and vigorous campaign by a sympathetic bishop, in November 1971, he received his pardon.
When President Pompidou pardoned him of his last remaining charges, it backfired.
Protests erupted across France. Famous Nazi hunters Serge and Beate Klarsfeld spearheaded the demonstrations.
The reaction of the world of the resistance was impressive. Many protests.
There was outrage that, first of all, that these crimes had essentially gone unpunished after all. Regardless of the legal questions, I mean, this man was a murderer, unquestionably a murderer.
We protested immediately, and we invaded even the house of Touvier.
Touvier was under siege. Desperate, he agreed to do a television interview in disguise to defend his war record.
But what could I have done? What? Faced with the Germans, who were the masters of the country.
But his victims weren't fooled. They filed lawsuits against Touvier. As a result, he was now charged with crimes against humanity, charges which hold no statute of limitation.
Touvier goes from being a man who looks like he's gonna slide back into kind of a comfortable anonymity and live in his family home to a celebrity of the worst kind. And then he's forced to go into hiding again.
It's these charges of crimes against humanity that have led Recordon and his men to pursue Paul Touvier. Now, the detectives follow the money trail to Paris and the elderly secretary of a Catholic charity.
We confirmed that there was a network set up to collect money. The money was passed on to Touvier through a woman named Geneviève Penou.
Recordon pays a visit to Penou to question her about the money.
I explained to this woman the purpose of my investigation, but she answered she don't want to help. I was amazed by this kind of answer.
Finally, Recordon wears her down.
She requested to phone her priest in order to obtain his agreement, because she don't want to be in infringement with divine justice. It was amazing. It was amazing. The priest advised the woman, please give the information to the investigator.
Madame Penou reveals that she has been sending money to Paul Touvier at a fundamentalist Carmelite convent 200 miles south of Paris.
For her, it was an obligation, according to the Catholic rule, to help this family.
At this stage of the investigation, things started to accelerate very quickly. So the team left Paris by plane. At that time, the police had their own planes, and 4 of us left. Another group went by car.
After 4 decades, the net is closing on Paul Touvier. But there is a real danger. If he gets wind of the operation, he will vanish.
It's why I decided to move very quickly.
French detectives are closing in on war criminal Paul Touvier. They have flown to his last known hiding place, a convent 200 miles south of Paris.
A sister was surprised about the huge number of police officers in front of her. I said, I am in charge to perform an investigation in your convent.
Donc on rencontre la mère supérieure. We met the Mother Superior and the abbot. We told them why we were there. We had to conduct a search.
Je suis chargé de la perquisition. The team questions the nuns, while Recordon confronts the abbot.
And I started to interrogate this priest. Touvier, I don't know Touvier.
There was a small chapel, behind some buildings and garages.
I was at the entrance discussing with the priest when one of an investigator came to me saying, we have found some suitcases with the name of Paul Lacroix.
In one building, we found some cases labeled with a name that we recognized as one of Paul Touvier's aliases. We opened the cases and discovered Paul Touvier's past.
And the first thing we saw was the Iron Cross. I look at the priest. You don't know Touvier? My investigator looked at the document, Paul Touvier, and so on. You don't know this guy?
Investigators haven't found the war criminal, but they have found solid proof that the fundamentalists have been sheltering him. In one trunk, they discover writings by Nazi propagandist Philippe Henriot. It is a direct link to one of the worst wartime atrocities committed by Touvier.
Philippe Henriot was the Minister of Propaganda under Vichy, and he was a hero of the milice.
Philippe Henriot was an extremely effective radio commentator. He was doing quite a lot of damage to the Allied cause. He was really getting somewhere with these radio broadcasts. The resistance assassinated him on the 28th of June.
And throughout France, miliciens groups and other supporters of Vichy decided to exact vengeance. The account that finally emerges is that he rounded up a number of Jews, and then he took 7 of these and took them out early in the morning at the end of June 1944, lined them up against a cemetery wall and shot them, and left the bodies as examples for people to see.
Paul Touvier must have been living there, but left very quickly. There were current photos of him with his children, his wife. This was our treasure. We had a photo. That was important because the most recent photo we had was from 1973. We questioned the abbot. He said he didn't know anything.
I say, you have to respect the French law. Now, where is Paul Touvier?
The Mother Superior takes matters into her own hands.
Mother Superior asked the abbot to swear on the cross that he didn't know anything. He was trapped. Mother Superior really shook him up. She made him admit that he knew where Paul Touvier was.
He said to me, Touvier, for 2 weeks, is at the Saint Joseph Monastery in Nice.
It's a critical point in the case. But Nice is 500 miles south on the Mediterranean coast. There is no time to lose.
It was 11 p.m. Due to the fact that my team was very tired and more tired than me, I decided to take the wheel and to drive myself until Nice. Nothing could stop my investigation.
French detectives drive through the night. They're heading for a monastery in Nice. After more than a year, the hunt for war criminal Paul Touvier is entering the end game.
We had to move fast. We hadn't slept since Monday. We've been on the go with no rest. We drove at 150, 160.
I took one photograph with me, and with this photograph, now I can put an image on a guy. Now Touvier, for me, was very well identified.
Colonel Recordon calls ahead to authorities in Nice. He asks them to surround the monastery so that no one can arrive or leave.
And I said it was a very important case. I cannot speak about it by phone, but I have in my pocket an arrest warrant.
At dawn, we arrived on the outskirts of Nice. There were already 6 or 7 undercover police officers surrounding the monastery. Recordon told my colleague and I to go around back so we could enter from the rear and the front at the same time. But we weren't sure if he was inside. We had our doubts. We just didn't know.
I knocked at the door, and a priest opened the door. He was surprised, and I suppose a little bit terrified.
The panicked priest tries to keep the investigators out.
I had placed my foot in the door, and violently I opened the door.
In the meantime, we were in the courtyard, broke down a door, and met up with Recordon. 4 of us were inside, but there was only one central staircase.
And my investigators rushed in the staircase. I grasped the sleeve of the priest, and together we climbed the staircase.
At the top of the stairs, there were 2 corridors. Recordon went left with one colleague, and I went right with another.
My investigator, a few seconds opening on each side, the door, and I followed, taking the priest by the sleeve. And at this stage, my heart was bumping quickly. And near the end of the corridor, I noticed an investigator stand still in the frame of the door. And in the middle of the room, I saw Paul Touvier.
After more than 4 decades on the run, Nazi collaborator Paul Touvier is cornered.
When I saw this guy standing in the middle of the room, instantaneously, I recognized him as Paul Touvier.
Paul Touvier had a distinctive look. He had piercing blue eyes. I remembered war films with blue-eyed Nazis, and that shook me up.
A few seconds later, a wife came, followed by her son and her daughter, crying. And Touvier, brusquely, nastily, ordered them, shut up, go back to your rooms. What they did without a word. And I recognized the guy in charge of the intelligence service of the milice when he spoke to the resistant, to the Jew. I think it was the same guy, the bad guy, very bad guy.
As for his children, it was sad. They were 35 or 36 years old, and they'd never had a life. They had always lived in a monastery or abbey.
Colonel Recordon called me to tell me that Paul Touvier had been arrested. This was a big moment for me, because all of the efforts we had put in together had concluded in a positive result. It was a clap of thunder. Fantastic.
For me, I won. I just won my investigation. I don't know how in English I say soulagé. I was released. After the Touvier arrest, I have a thought concerning the poor people in the concentration camps. And I thought, now is the justice time.
We had, after 40 years, finally arrested Paul Touvier. There was a flood of journalists.
Touvier faces 6 counts of crimes against humanity.
He read a statement to me. I dispute having committed crimes against humanity. I was only doing my job. He had no regrets.
The investigation has shone a revealing light on a dark and secretive corner of the French Catholic Church. Paul Touvier's arrest also shows that anti-Semitism is alive and kicking in modern France. Within days, "Death to Jews" is scrawled on a synagogue in Rouen. 5 years after Touvier's capture, his trial opens in Versailles, once home to France's kings and queens. Tensions run high in a nation still scarred by the war.
One of the big moments in the trial is that during the 80s, he kept these notebooks called the Green Notebooks. And while he, at his trial, denied that he had maintained the same animosities he'd had before the war, when the Green Notebooks are read at his trial, it's clear that ideologically, this is a man absolutely frozen in the past. It became clear that he was very much the same man who had joined the milice and was willing to carry out crimes. Touvier was a very hateful man.
These secret notebooks help seal Touvier's fate. He is found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. It's an historic verdict.
Touvier was the first French citizen to be tried for and found guilty of crimes against humanity in a French court. And that's really quite extraordinary. There are not many countries that have prosecuted their own citizens for crimes against humanity.
I was looking for my mother all my life. Paul Touvier was the man who arrested my mother and sent my mother to Auschwitz. Paul Touvier has to assume the responsibility of my life, of my hell.
The hunt of Touvier, for me, was a classical inquiry. Challenging, demanding, and also the right will, the determination. It was possible to succeed.
Stangl was in charge of a massive killing machine.
He was responsible for the deaths of 800,000 people. Wiesenthal starts getting on his case.
His plan was to smoke him out.
They were fiercely loyal to the old Germany, to the Reich.
He was an enormous fish for the Germans to bring back.
He had trainees, one of whom was Gustav Wagner.
He was called the Beast.
Simon Wiesenthal is the world's most famous Nazi hunter. In his office at the Jewish Documentation Center, he keeps files on hundreds of fugitive war criminals. It is solitary work. But today brings an unexpected turn.
A drunken man turns up at his office and tells him, if you give me $7,000, I will tell you where to find Franz Stangl.
Stangl was in charge of a massive killing machine responsible for the death of 800,000 people. That's big-time mass murder.
Wiesenthal is intrigued. Franz Stangl is high on his list of wanted war criminals, but he can't help but be suspicious of the unusual offer.
Stangl was a monster, but Wiesenthal wanted to make sure that he had a man that he could trust.
Wiesenthal does a deal with the stranger, but it will only be sealed with Stangl's capture.
He does find out from the man where he's working and his address. Stangl and his family are in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Simon Wiesenthal never sees the mysterious informant again. He's carried a photo of Franz Stangl in his wallet for years. Now, it's time to bring the Nazi to justice.
Franz Stangl was a career policeman. He was an Austrian, and with the arrival of Nazism, he joined the Nazi Party, and he also became a member of the SS.
Then he worked his way up the Nazi Party ranks. Stangl was drafted into a special program in Austria at Hartheim Castle.
He takes part in the T4 program. People who are crippled or mentally handicapped are gassed to death on the grounds that they are Untermenschen, they are inferior beings.
It was a training school for mass murderers. They were carefully groomed.
Can you stand there and watch people being injected? Can you stand there and watch 150 people being gassed in the chamber?
He enjoyed murdering people in Hartheim. He was a passionate believer in Hitler's theories of race and the superiority of the Aryans.
Himmler, who was the head of the SS, personally selected Franz Stangl to supervise this place. He appointed him to that post because he knew that he could handle it. By the time they finished, they had murdered around 30,000 people.
After the war, Franz Stangl found refuge in Brazil. He built a comfortable life for his wife and 3 daughters.
There's a big German community in Sao Paulo. It's like home from home. He's happy.
They got their Wurst and their Wiener Schnitzels. They used to celebrate Hitler's birthday, sing old German drinking songs. They were good neighbors, productive members of the community.
He worked in a car factory. He started to make quite a bit of money.
The war criminal is eventually able to move his family into a spacious new home.
And he finally thinks, that's it. I put the old world, all my crimes behind me. I'll be forgotten.
But Wiesenthal has not forgotten. Like other victims of Nazi cruelty, he cannot forget. He and his wife Silla, also a survivor, lost 89 relatives to the Holocaust.
Anyone who's gone through the Holocaust, they will never be able to remove that image. Wiesenthal went through it, and he had to keep the cause going.
With a new lead in hand, Wiesenthal reaches out to Brazilian contacts to confirm his target's location. But finding Stangl is just a first step. Bringing him to Europe to face justice is a much more difficult task.
After Wiesenthal's discovery of Stangl, he didn't just want to phone up the Brazilians to try and get the extradition in place, because he knew that things would leak and Stangl would just flee.
To maintain secrecy, Wiesenthal deals only with a network of trusted contacts. He cannot risk alerting the Nazi sympathizers in Brazil.
Every major country in South America had huge pockets of Germans. They were fiercely loyal to the old Germany, to the Reich.
Nazi loyalty could jeopardize Wiesenthal's plan. Franz Stangl may have friends willing to protect him, friends ready to do whatever it takes to stop a famous Nazi hunter. From his Vienna headquarters, Simon Wiesenthal works to set a trap for Nazi war criminal Franz Stangl. he consults government sources and scours historical archives for buried information.
The public had to have one hero keeping the hunt going in the days where everyone was uninterested. And Wiesenthal was that man.
20 years after the war, Wiesenthal is one of the very few people tracking down Nazis.
People were sick and tired of war stories. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal were interested, but I tell you, the rest of the world was not. They were more interested in finding the communist under the bed.
Despite the lack of public interest, Wiesenthal continues the hunt. He digs deeper into Stangl's wartime career, a career which took him from one atrocity to the next.
He impresses his betters at Schloss Hartheim, and Stangl eventually takes part in the next new Nazi extermination program called Operation Reinhardt.
Operation Reinhardt was the code name for the mass murder of Polish Jews at death camps.
The purpose of a death camp is solely to kill. And there were 3 in eastern Poland: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka.
They were just processing centers for slaughter. And Stangl found himself running these places. You had a hope of surviving Auschwitz. You had no hope of surviving these extermination camps.
Only a handful of people ever escaped. Wiesenthal tracks some of them down. As witnesses to genocide, they expose the inner workings of the Nazi killing operation and Stangl's central role in it.
The Jews would be packed on trains through the wastelands of that part of Poland. And they'd arrive at this station in the middle of nowhere. And the station would have flowers and a clock and a timetable. If you're a Jew coming off this tortuous, horrid journey from Warsaw, you think maybe there's some normality returning, maybe things aren't too bad. And there would be Franz Stangl.
His job was to be in charge of the processing. He dressed to the nines, white coat and white gloves and perfectly pressed pants and polished shoes.
Behind the station was the scene of utter horror. They were funneled down a tunnel, they were stripped, and then they were gassed, and then they were burnt.
From the whistle to the smoke, 30 minutes.
So you'd be arriving at the station, and before the hour was gone, you'd be dead.
Wiesenthal promises each survivor that he will never stop hunting the former camp commandant until justice is served. Meanwhile, in Germany, an historic trial underscores the urgency of Wiesenthal's mission. Ten former SS men who worked at Treblinka stand accused of war crimes. Stangl is not among them.
He was responsible at Treblinka for the deaths of 800,000 people. But if you look through the war crimes lists, there's no Stangl in there.
He was the chief. He didn't get his hands dirty. He didn't have to go and slit throats.
During the course of the 10-month-long trial, Stangl's crimes, along with those of his former colleagues, are finally exposed to the world. But in Brazil, he remains a free man.
Wiesenthal puts a lot of pressure on the Brazilian authorities to get something done.
Finally, in January 1967, the effort begins to pay off. Brazilian authorities promise to arrest Stangl if Germany sends a formal extradition request. Wiesenthal assists prosecutors by assembling a detailed dossier of Stangl's crimes. Brazil, Sao Paulo police chief Romeo Tuma lays the groundwork for the Nazis' arrest.
They map out the area and they work out what they need to do. The core of their mission is to stake out the house. And by doing that, they watch his family. They try to work out what time he comes back home.
Unaware of the police surveillance, the threat of arrest is something Stangl thought he'd left far behind. After the war, Stangl spent 2 years in an American POW camp, but the Allies were largely unaware of his horrific crimes.
He's interned by the Americans, but they don't know who he is.
Stangl knows that there's a noose if he doesn't escape.
You like to think that Stangl, had to devise some incredibly cunning means of escaping from the camp, but of course, he basically just walks out.
Security around these internment camps is pretty lax.
So he made his way through Austria down to the Austrian town of Graz, and with another man, decides to use the Catholic Church as their means of escape.
These escape routes were called rat lines, R-A-T, like rats leaving the ship. The most famous rat line was called the Vatican rat line in Rome. And he heard there was an Austrian bishop in Rome by the name of Alois Hudal.
Hudal is at the heart of this Nazi escape network. And Hudal welcomes them and says, "I've been expecting you." Hudal says, "Could you fill out a little CV, a little resume of your career during the war?" Funnily enough, you can't find the words either Treblinka or Sobibor on them.
He got immigration cards for Stangl to go to Syria.
From Syria in 1951, Stangl and his family sail for a new life in South America. 16 years later, Stangl's world is about to crumble.
This man was responsible for so much death, was unmolested for so many years.
It's time to get this guy.
February 1967. Sao Paulo police make final preparations for the takedown of former Nazi death camp commandant, Franz Stangl. Chief Tuma receives the crucial extradition document that greenlights the mission.
Stangl's picked up just on an ordinary day for him. He's come back from work and he's decided to meet up with his daughter for a beer at a little bar not too far from his house. And he comes back home. Suddenly a squad car turns up. Policemen get out.
There was just no contest. There was no chance of him escaping.
He felt, I'm untouchable.
And they literally bundle Stangl into the back of the car while the daughter is screaming. It's a pretty gut-wrenching thing to watch happening to your father.
Police take Stangl to prison to await extradition. 5,000 miles away in Vienna. What Simon Wiesenthal doesn't know is that Stangl's capture will eventually put him on the trail of another major war criminal. When questioned, the former death camp commandant insists his job was simply to record the victims' names before they were gassed.
One of those banal excuses these Nazi war criminals always gave was, I was just obeying orders.
I'm not going to admit that I did something wrong because I didn't do anything wrong.
He lacked the absolute moral bravery to say, look, I think that's a bad thing to do, and I want no part of it. Stangl was one of those people without whom Nazism could not have functioned.
Days later, Wiesenthal hears from the mysterious informant. As promised, he honors their agreement. But he never reveals the man's identity.
Some people have suggested that, in fact, it was Stangl's former son-in-law who had actually shot Stangl to Wiesenthal. The reason why he was suspected, they had rather spectacularly fallen out. He had divorced Stangl's daughter. And he thought, well, I'm going to get my revenge. I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll ring Simon Wiesenthal. The Stangl family to this day are convinced it is that man.
In June 1967, Franz Stangl arrives in Germany to face charges of genocide.
He was an enormous fish for the Germans to bring back.
The Stangl trial was another one of those key moments in Holocaust history, fundamentally, because people hadn't quite realized what had been going on in these camps, and the fact that people like Stangl were still alive, and they had been working anonymous, boring, quiet lives on the other side of the world for so many years.
They don't come with big horns, blood dripping off their fangs. They look like your local cab driver, the local grocer.
On December 22nd, 1970, Simon Wiesenthal watches from the gallery as the court's verdict comes down. Guilty. For his role in the murder of 900,000 people, Franz Stangl is sentenced to life in prison.
It takes 3 years, according to Wiesenthal, for Stangl eventually to be brought to justice. And of course his family were maintained that he was an innocent man, but of course Stangl was not an innocent man.
Finally, 25 years after the fall of the Nazi regime, Simon Wiesenthal closes the file on Franz Stangl. 4 months later, Stangl agrees to a prison interview with celebrated journalist Gita Sereny. In the interview, he drops a bombshell, one that will put Simon Wiesenthal back in the hunt for another major Nazi criminal.
When he sat down in the prison and was interviewed, he revealed the secret about his past.
He quite happily took shopped to his old friend Gustav Wagner. And revealed that he too was living over there in Sao Paulo. You know, such is the SS motto, you know, my honor is loyalty. When these guys are caught and the chips are down, they'll shop each other.
At Hartheim Castle Killing Center, Stangl's special skills had made him an excellent teacher.
He had trainees, one of whom was Gustav Wagner.
And gradually the people like Wagner who were introduced into this murder machine were tested. Wagner passed the test.
He was a good student. He enjoyed killing.
One day after giving up his fellow SS officer, Franz Stangl dies of a heart attack.
He lived a good life until he was 63. The guy only spent 1 year in a nice prison in Dusseldorf.
After it's revealed that Wagner is actually in Brazil, Wiesenthal starts getting on his case.
Gustav Wagner was one of the most vindictive, sadistic mass murderers in the world, who just glorified in playing God.
After their posting at Hartheim, both men reported to Sobibor death camp. Stangl was the new commandant, Wagner his deputy. When Stangl was transferred to Treblinka, Sobibor needed a new boss.
And Stangl asked for Wagner. Every camp has this one person that everyone is afraid of, and it was Wagner.
He was called the Beast.
Because the moment he was seen, you knew that someone was going to die.
June 1971. Simon Wiesenthal's new mission is tracking down Nazi war criminal Gustav Wagner in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Wiesenthal knows that Wagner is there, but doesn't know the name under which he's living. And Wiesenthal didn't know where he's living.
His contacts in Brazil find a copy of Wagner's first Brazilian passport, but the address listed is long out of date. New leads prove scarce, but the memory of the Nazi and his crimes never fade for Sobibor survivor Thomas Blatt.
Wagner was a very tall guy. He was huge, he was strong. Seeing him 200 meters away, I was shaking. He was the biggest killer in Sobibor. He was terrible, very sadistic. I was beaten so many times for him.
His greatest trick was to be able to shoot a father and son with one bullet, force the father and son to lean their heads together.
He found a woman who smuggled her baby into a knapsack into the camp. He brought the baby and mother outside, made the mother kneel, and he shot the baby first. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then he shot her.
He had successfully murdered over 200,000 people.
Like his mentor Franz Stangl, Wagner eluded the Allies after the war. He returned home to Austria. He was still there when Stangl came looking for the rat line.
Stangl was walking through there. Suddenly there's a kind of a wolf whistle or a whistle from a building site, and it's, "Hi, Franz." And who is it? It's his old friend Gustav Wagner. And they decide that they're going to try and find a new life overseas.
Both Stangl and Wagner ended up in Brazil. They started off together. They ended up together. They lived about 30 miles apart.
It's almost chilling to reflect upon the fact that when these Nazis were on the run or in their new lives, a lot of them used to be very friendly with each other. Eichmann and Mengele would meet sometimes in the ABC Cafe in Buenos Aires. And with Stangl and Wagner, it was just the same. Once in a while, they would meet up for some drinks, something to eat. One would shudder to think of what they actually discussed.
He just becomes part of the German community in the hills outside Sao Paulo. He marries a local woman who's got children till the woman dies, and he is then left to them.
After Stangl had been arrested and extradited, Wagner even tried to make a move on Mrs. Stangl.
But he failed to win her over. All she offered him was money in return for a promise to leave her alone. Simon Wiesenthal still does not know where Gustav Wagner is hiding. The trail goes cold and stays cold for 7 years. Finally, Wiesenthal stumbles upon a potential new lead, a newspaper article describing a strange celebration at a hotel in Brazil, a birthday party for Hitler. Might a loyal Nazi like Gustav Wagner have been on the guest list? Wiesenthal tracks down the journalists behind the story.
By that time, I was a staff photographer from Jornal do Brasil. And my boss said, well, we have an assignment. Somebody sent to the newspaper anonymous invitation. This is like a Nazi meeting to celebrate Hitler's birthday, but it was all in code. So I said, well, okay, let's go hunt Nazi.
Brito teams up with a reporter from the paper. The reporter's husband offers to drive.
And we drove hours and hours and hours, and we couldn't find a thing, a person, not even a cow. I said, well, let's stop and eat something. So we stopped on the Till Hotel. We all look very German, so nobody would say, oh, they are Brazilian, they are journalists. We went to the restaurant. There was like those knickknacks. And I started looking, and I said, oh my gosh, it's not possible. There was tiny little porcelains, cups and things, and all of them, they had a little swastika. I said, oh my gosh, we are here. And we looked by the window. There was a group of German people dressed in folklore clothes. We went to this area on the back where they were. I tried to put the writer and the husband in an angle that I would look like I was taking their picture, but actually I was focusing the group. When the German group started realizing that we were taking pictures is when we decided to go to the police. It was a scary moment.
By the time the police arrive, the celebration is over. Only a few of the partygoers remain.
I remember the police asking this Nazi for the passport to see if he got in legally. It starts an argument between the police and the owner of the hotel.
The angry hotel guest is defiant. Police decide to search his room.
And I remember the police in his room and opened a bedside table, and there was a gun there, fully loaded, plus a box of munitions. So he was not here for fun. When the police found the gun, the man was out of his mind. The owner of the hotel was screaming. He started running after us. We had that sense that we had a really good story. But we had no idea of the significance of what we were doing.
Brazilian journalists have stumbled upon a bizarre birthday party for Hitler. The extraordinary pictures are shown around the world. Wiesenthal contacts the Journal do Brasil and asks for all of Brito's photos. But when he searches through them, Gustav Wagner's face is absent. But Wiesenthal, determined as ever, devises a new plan.
He was afraid that Wagner would get whiff of this thing and run. So he played a game, a kind of game that Wagner himself would play. He sent one of the pictures back to the journalist, and he put Wagner's name under it and Wagner's SS number and said, print it.
The Brazilian paper runs a story detailing Wagner's war crimes.
Wiesenthal makes an announcement to the world that one particular man in that photograph is Gustav Wagner, the wanted murderer from Sobibor, and he should be arrested. When Wiesenthal made that statement, he knew it wasn't Wagner, but his plan was to smoke him out.
For Wagner, the article is both worrying and perplexing. His record of war crimes has now been exposed to the world, but the face in the photograph is not his.
There is some discussion among scholars, and a few days later, this German that was identified as Wagner was murdered. Nobody knows by whom.
One theory is that actually the Nazis turned upon themselves, and knowing that Wagner was likely to be brought to justice, he would probably spill the beans on some of them as well. So perhaps it was his fellow Nazis who did him in.
So Wagner got nervous. He figured, if they got this guy, better to be protected by the police than to be killed. So he turned himself into the police.
The Nazi hunter's ploy has worked perfectly. In police custody, Wagner admits to being at Sobibor, although he denies any involvement in the atrocities. Police can see he's not the Nazi in the pictures. If they can't prove he's a war criminal, he'll walk free in 48 hours. But then, a remarkable coincidence changes everything. A coincidence involving one of the few survivors of Sobibor, Shlomo Smajner.
Gustav, o senhor é mesmo o homem que foi julgado em Nuremberg e condenado.
One day, Shlomo, who was living in Brazil, was watching evening television. The set flashed a figure of Gustav Wagner. Shlomo exploded. He couldn't believe that he and Wagner were breathing the same air. So he jumped on a plane and he went down to Sao Paulo and he went to the police station.
Authorities now have the perfect opportunity to nail Wagner. Police Chief Tuma arranges a face-to-face meeting between the former victim and his tormentor.
Este homem está dizendo que o senhor era o chefe do campo de concentração.
Não, isso não é verdade. Chefe foi Stangl.
Stangl? Franz Stangl. Agora, chefe, Spitz, era Oberscharführer Gustav Wagner.
Ele fala...
He doesn't dream that in that situation, one of the very few people to survive Sobibor should be in the same city and come up to him.
Vocês matavam, fuzilavam, rebentavam, faziam o que queria e ninguém. Você hoje, depois de 36 anos, seja um pouco de macho, homem.
And he says to Shlomo, you should be grateful to me, I let you live. I mean, that is just the most astonishing admission of guilt.
His identity confirmed, Wagner is now held pending extradition.
Everybody wanted Wagner. Poland wanted him because Sobibor. West Germany wanted him for major war crimes. Israel wanted to hang him.
He knew that he was on a conveyor belt to stand trial and spend the rest of his life in prison, just like Stangl and others had. He was terrified with that prospect.
While he's in custody, Wagner goes seriously over the edge.
Brazilian prisons are not very pleasant places.
weeks into his incarceration, Wagner attempts suicide by smashing his reading glasses and eating the broken glass.
The man was never stable to begin with, frankly, and with this enormous pressure, he grows increasingly suicidal. He threatens to subdue himself in.
And he's locked up in a prison hospital in Brasilia.
He attempts suicide twice more, slitting his wrists in a bathtub and bashing his head against a wall. Wagner's fate now rests with the Brazilian Supreme Court.
His life would never be the same again.
It's been 35 years since Gustav Wagner's brutal reign of terror at the Sobibor death camp. The decision to put him on trial for his crimes now rests with Brazilian judges.
The Supreme Court of Brazil, for some technical reason, decided that it would not allow the extradition of Gustav Wagner.
And the Brazilians released Wagner to go back home.
The shocking decision is condemned around the world.
There was no legal reason why they shouldn't extradite Wagner. The evidence against Wagner was just as overwhelming as against Stangl. But there was no real future for him anymore in Brazil. He knew that whatever happened, now that he had been exposed, people would hunt him down. Whether it was Wiesenthal or the survivors.
And the next thing we know, he's dead.
He's found with supposedly self-inflicted knife wounds.
His family said he was stabbed in the chest, and it was suicide.
Now, there are a lot of people think that actually he was the victim of a murder. It's pretty hard to sort of stab yourself to death in the way he had done. One theory about how Wagner was killed was that maybe it had been a vengeful survivor who had done so. Maybe someone who had survived Sobibor tracked him down and actually murdered him.
And I interviewed Shlomo, and I asked him about Wagner. And he looked at me with a sly smile, and he said, he committed suicide by stabbing himself in the chest, and he laughed.
I would like to kill him, but I wouldn't do it because I would go to jail. First of all, my family would be ruined. So different things for consideration. If I would be alone, probably I would.
Wagner escaped justice. He should have suffered the trial and suffered long imprisonment. He'd enjoyed many years of happy life in Brazil, which he shouldn't have been allowed to enjoy.
It's a mystery even to this day quite how Wagner met his end, but it was certainly a violent end, and if one believes in a certain sense of biblical, poetic justice, he certainly met it.
Simon Wiesenthal, history's most famous Nazi hunter, claims responsibility for bringing hundreds of Nazis to justice. None are more important than Franz, Stangl, and Gustav Wagner.
Stangl and Wagner, between them, have 1 million lives on their conscience. It was thanks to him and the pressure that he brought to bear that men like Stangl and Wagner met their fates.
He did come to symbolize the hunt for the Nazi war criminals when everyone else had forgotten it.
In 2004, Britain awards Wiesenthal an honorary knighthood for his extraordinary achievements. Dying in 2005 at the age of 96, he outlived most of the Nazi criminals he hunted.
The satisfaction came from the world now knows.